It's My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast. On the show this week, we'll talk about the latest episode of The Bad Batch. Omega is still my spirit clone. Speaking of clones, a rather interesting Rogue One connection in this week's episode. Plus, I was inspired by a podcast of an old debate about The Last Jedi. And I want to talk about the future of the saga films and where they could potentially go. Plus, as always, we will dive into your listener feedback. Let's not waste any more time and get right to this week's show.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you. Just let it in.
Welcome to it. I am your host, Jon Justice, for another episode of a Star Wars podcast. Still really enjoying The Bad Batch, and I think I'm zeroing in, at least on one of the reasons why it's a popular show so far. I think, one, it's a good show, but I think the other aspect, too, is that we are... and I've alluded to this before, but we are heading into a moment in time that we haven't spent a ton of time on. This transition, which is something that we'll get into with this latest episode, and a mystery that was kind of solved in this most recent episode. But we are transitioning into a part of the timeline where the galaxy is in flux. Mentioned this last week. The Republic has gone away. The Empire is forming. And we are still playing in this Clone Wars world while the Clone Wars are no longer occurring. So I think that in and of itself has sort of, I don't want to say solved the problem, but because it wasn't a problem, but that in and of itself is what really separates the Bad Batch out from the Clone Wars. And I think it was very clever for the creators to go and take the logo of the Clone Wars and have it burn away to the Bad Batch in that first episode. And I think that's why a lot of people like myself were really surprised to be enjoying this show as much as we did, especially based off that first episode, because it felt like we were heading into very familiar territory of the Clone Wars, only to suddenly realize, no, of course, we're going to see Order, 66 again. We're going to move beyond the Clone Wars, and now we have this completely different story of these, really just a group of soldiers on the run with this really compelling young female character in Omega. So let's get into that a little bit later on in the show. I was listening to, and I'll explain how I found it, but on Sirius XM, I ended up finding a Star Wars show. There's not a lot of episodes in there, but I found a Star Wars show, and it was a group of individuals who had talked about Mandalorian, going all the way back to The Last Jedi and the Rise of Skywalker, and debating whether or not they liked these particular live-action pieces of content. There was some rather interesting talk. Nothing that we haven't heard before, but it sent me down a path of speculating on the future of the franchise, especially given this rumor that's floating around that I don't think there's a ton of merit to, but there's a rumor floating around that Daisy Ridley has been in talks with Lucasfilm to reprise her role as Rey. So we'll get into that a little bit later and your listener feedback. But first, let's go to this article from Inverse, because they lay out the fix that the most recent episode of The Bad Batch apparently did for a Rogue One mystery. It's kind of a wonky way of wording it, but this is what the Inverse article had to say. If you're still curious how the clone army of the Republic evolved into a mostly all-human fleet of stormtroopers, right, of the Galactic Republic, don't worry. The Bad Batch is fully dedicated to splitting all these genetically duplicated Jango Fett hairs. So in the third episode of The Bad Batch, The Replacements, the story digs deeper into, I guess it's just replacements, there's no "the" on it. The story digs deeper into this moment of transition for the Empire, and in doing so seems to introduce another variant of a stormtrooper, the apparent prototype for the Death Troopers first glimpsed in Rogue One. Actually watched Rogue One just yesterday. Have some thoughts on that I'll get to a little bit later on. Fantastic film, by the way. I understand why so many people consider it their favorite of the Disney era, but we'll get to that later. So here's the latest layer of Stormtrooper Gate that the Bad Batch recontextualizes Rogue One and the rest of the saga. So all spoilers ahead, right, for the Bad Batch Replacements Episode 3. So the debut of the Bad Batch seemed to float an economic explanation for the switch from clones to human recruits. The third episode digs into this question even deeper when Imperial Vice Admiral Rampart shows up on Kamino. He brings with him 4 new recruits. Rampart calls these people our first elite squad and pitches the idea of having an army of human troopers trained by really good clones. So after turning his back on the Batch, right, because of the chip, Crosshair is selected as the best person to command this new group of recruits. While Tarkin and Rampart chat about the idea of having a mixed army consisting of both clones and recruited conscripted soldiers. But the interesting twist is the way this new elite squad is actually dressed. In many ways, these troopers look like the Death Troopers first introduced in Rogue One. Now, since 2016, Star Wars fans have wondered how to account for the existence of Death Troopers in the overall canon. Obviously, we don't see these elite soldiers in the classic trilogy because they were invented for Rogue One. After that film, we see them pop up in Star Wars Rebels and in The Mandalorian season 1. In theory, however, the events of the Bad Batch happen 19 years before the Battle of Yavin, BBY, and a year before Darth Vader Annual Number 2, meaning in all likelihood we are currently witnessing the birth of Death Troopers right alongside the invention of Stormtroopers. So to be clear, the charcoal black uniforms of the new elite troopers in the Bad Batch aren't an exact match for the Death Troopers in Rogue One, and the helmets are a little bit different. The thing that really stuck out to me was the green lenses, right? And whether or not they are doing that intentionally, I tend to think they are. Even though I know that other Stormtrooper costumes also have those green-tinted lenses. They seemed very specific and very pronounced in the Death Troopers. It feels very pointed that their uniforms are not white like the regular clones or Stormtroopers, assuming that the new troopers from the Bad Batch are the first group that will eventually become Death Troopers. There's an obvious next question. Could Crosshair, formerly of Clone Force 99, actually be present for the events of Rogue One? By the way, there are some rumors going around. Apparently the composers had hinted towards a very dramatic ending to the Bad Batch. And I can see that building up. This season of the Bad Batch really does have this sort of, well, the same vibe as the other pieces of serial content that we've received from the Disney era of Star Wars, right? We have your sort of filler, doing that thing with my finger episodes that add elements to the story that's going on, and then you have the larger stories that are focusing on the bigger picture of the entire story in and of itself. We've seen that with all the series, whether it's The Mandalorian, whether it's Resistance and Rebels, and of course Clone Wars, and we're seeing it play out very similarly in the Bad Batch as well. So at first glance, right, it doesn't add up. Crosshair would be way too old for Rogue One, which happens literally in the same year as A New Hope. But Rogue One also contains a prologue that happens 15 years before the events of the rest of the movie. 15 BBY, which puts it roughly 4 years after the events of Revenge of the Sith. Because the Bad Batch happens right after the Sith, that also puts it about 3 to 4 years before this Rogue One prologue. So, could Crosshair have stayed with his elite troopers long enough to go with Krennic to hassle Galen Erso it's all kind of depends on what happens with Crosshair, obviously, through the rest of the Bad Batch. But even if he doesn't stick with the Empire by the end of the series, the origin of both the Death Troopers and the Stormtroopers is well underway. The Bad Batch is ostensibly telling the story of Clone Force 99 on the run with their foster child, Omega. But it's also explaining exactly how the Empire got all of its muscle one trooper at a time. And this actually kind of plays in a bit to the next topic that I have on the show. I didn't plan it this way, but it actually works quite nicely. If you have any comments, as always, on this latest episode of The Bad Batch, email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment up on YouTube.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
So on my, I have Sirius XM, because I listen to it pretty much exclusively for the NASCAR channel. But on there for May the 4th, they had put out a promotion for a bunch of Star Wars content that they had on the app. And in it was a series of different interviews and shows. There's actually a really fantastic interview. I'm gonna pull up the app right now on my phone. There's a fantastic interview that was done with J.J. Abrams right around the release of The Rise of Skywalker, and he gets into some really specific details with regard to his opinion of The Last Jedi and what he did with The Rise of Skywalker to try to pay tribute to The Last Jedi and his positive feelings towards The Last Jedi. If you have the opportunity to track it down, I believe it's an Entertainment Weekly interview. I suggest you do so. This other channel that I found, The Untold Stories of Star Wars, Entertainment and Star Wars Untold Stories. And in this, they've got a group of panelists, and they discuss in different episodes, as I mentioned, The Mandalorian. I believe there's a solo conversation, and then post-commentary reviews for The Rise of Skywalker and The Last Jedi, both of which the majority of the people on the panel were critical of both those films. But it was interesting because in listening to this Last Jedi debate show on Sirius XM, they got into this topic of Rey Nobody, and there were several fans of the film, people that liked The Last Jedi, but were upset at what happened with The Rise of Skywalker because of the choice to make Rey a Palpatine. And this is kind of what I wanted to get into briefly before we dive into listener feedback this week. There was a report that came out from Variety magazine that Kevin Feige of Marvel had been in talks, or may have been in talks, to take over Star Wars inside of Disney. But apparently he is not going to be doing that. He's going to be sticking with Marvel. I guess Kevin Feige from, I believe this was from the directors of Infinity War and Endgame, the Russo brothers, had said that Kevin Feige was actually a bigger Star Wars fan than he was a Marvel fan when he took over Marvel. But clearly he's done such an amazing job with the Marvel franchise that they want to keep him in that particular position. And what I'm going to do here is toss in a number of different items, news items, and things that I've heard Star Wars related, and try to craft a larger point. All right, so when it comes to Kevin Feige taking over Star Wars, this is always going to be a big deal when it's rumored because of the divisions within the fandom. That's the reason why it's a big deal. I think there's a lot of fans out there of Star Wars who fall on the more negative side of things when it comes to Disney, who look at what Marvel has been able to achieve and think that Kevin Feige could go and duplicate that over on the side of Star Wars, right? I'm in the camp of, you're looking at two different intellectual properties, two very different types of storytelling with arguably some different core fandoms at the heart of it, right? Marvel is a very different beast than Star Wars is. And this is the larger thing that I want to talk about. Because Star Wars, for better or worse, will always have this nostalgia attached to it that gives people the desire to form very strong opinions about what they watch, okay? So, for people to go and say Kevin Feige could go and do wonders for Star Wars like he did for Marvel, I think that's a little naive when you consider, again, the base of Marvel fans and how the Marvel movies, when they came out, were really something new and different that didn't grab the cultural zeitgeist in terms of expectations the way that Star Wars has always done since that original trilogy. So along with this, I was also listening to the Christian Science Fiction podcast, which is a podcast that I'm kind of a fan of. They were complaining about Star Wars. They again kind of fall into the category of the negative Disney era Star Wars, and they were kind of complaining about Star Wars, saying that it's been feeding off of nostalgia. I would argue that, the Star Wars does feed off of nostalgia, but can you even avoid that? Is that a bad thing? When you're playing in particular timelines for Star Wars, you can't help but bring about those feelings of nostalgia. It's embedded in the nature of the storytelling because of what it's attached to from that time period that those of us that are of a certain age already grew up with. And even beyond that, I think you also have nostalgia for the individuals that grew up with the prequels, just like you're eventually going to have nostalgia for the individuals that were first brought to Star Wars via the sequel trilogy. Okay? So the last point I want to make on this before I dive into the future of Star Wars is I'm planning on doing a new space opera podcast pretty soon. This is a side project that I had that, again, just kind of took a back seat because just how busy I am with the full-time job and the science fiction novel writing. But I'd heard this question arise recently, actually on a Star Wars podcast, about how Avatar was and still is the most successful film of all time, but it never grabbed onto the cultural consciousness, right? The way that other intellectual properties have. You don't have a fandom around Avatar. As a matter of fact, I went looking for an Avatar podcast, and there is no Avatar podcast. Well, there's a reason for that, in my opinion. This is what I'll get into in much more detail when I record that space opera podcast. But it's because it was a brand new property and a brand new universe that everybody was introduced to, and a story that was pretty much self-contained. So it's a lot like Rogue One in that way, right? So Rogue One has the nostalgia fuel behind it, which is part of its popularity, apart from it just being a great film. But it's arguably a lot of Star Wars fans' Disney-era favorite film. But yet, we don't talk about Rogue One all that much for the same reason that Avatar didn't grab on to the cultural zeitgeist, because there really isn't anything to discuss. There's no further mythology to discuss within Rogue One. We got this cool little nugget from the Bad Batch, and I think that's what we will get when it comes to attaching things to Rogue One, are explanations of things that happened in Rogue One that maybe weren't completely fleshed out, like the introduction of Death Troopers. But beyond that, you're not seeing a whole lot of discussion around Rogue One, comparatively speaking, of course, to the discussions that we get for The Rise of Skywalker and The Last Jedi. It's because there's nothing to discuss. That film is over. Spoiler alert, they all died, and there's no mythology there. What will be really interesting when it comes to Avatar, just briefly, is will the fandom be there for these next 4 Avatar films that James Cameron is making? Is he going to be able to create a mythology that the fandom is going to want to latch on to and discuss? That's going to be really, really interesting to see. Now, all of this brings me to this Last Jedi debate and Rey Nobody, and a couple of points I wanted to make before we dive into listener feedback this week. It got me thinking about the future of Star Wars, and especially saga films. We don't know when Rogue Squadron is going to take place. We still don't know what Taika Waititi is doing and where that falls in line in terms of the timeline of Star Wars, or what Kevin Feige's project is. But eventually, I do believe we're going to get an episode 10, 11, and 12, and a continuation of the main Star Wars saga line. So Rian Johnson and the sequels opened the door to the idea of many chosen ones. And while that is still in play, in my opinion, right? The Rise of Skywalker did, as we know, take the route of Anakin, Luke, and subsequently Rey potentially being chosen ones, or even Ben, which doesn't really get talked about enough, right? Just as people argue that Anakin, the sort of Anakin versus Luke Skywalker, which one was actually the chosen one, I think the same could apply to Ben. Ben sacrificed himself to save Rey and maintain balance in the Force. Now, back to my original point of Rey Palpatine versus Rey Nobody. As I was listening on this Last Jedi debate show, they were very much in the Rey Nobody camp, and when I got to the debate over the Rise of Skywalker, the individual who was in the Rey Nobody camp was, like so many, very frustrated that Rey became a Palpatine. However, I believe there is a really cool opportunity in the Rey Palpatine, now Rey Skywalker storytelling, wherein you could have a post the Rise of Skywalker story where it could be Rey haunted by the fact that she knows the darkness will rise. You could continue on with the saga much in the same way of having it be like, poetry, it rhymes, like Lucas has said, wherein Luke Skywalker in the sequel trilogy saw the darkness rising in Kylo Ren in Ben Solo, and through the actions of Ben Solo and the burning of the temple and the killing of his students, Luke sends himself into exile, and we get the line from The Last Jedi of, I've seen this sort of darkness once before, right, in Ben Solo. I think you could have a really interesting story where Rey is haunted by the fact that she knows the darkness will rise. Maybe she does what Luke Skywalker did and pulls back from the Force, perhaps to bring about a new light to meet the darkness. The larger point here, though, is that Disney and Lucasfilm now know that there is an audience for a story of an actual nobody who could rise to the rank of Jedi. And I would be really, really surprised if Disney didn't go that route at some point. Because there is clearly an audience, and I think regardless of people's opinions of The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker, I think a large majority of the fandom, including myself, would be really interested in seeing an actual nobody who would have to rise to meet the darkness like so many thought that Rey was doing. And having Rey be the catalyst for that could be a very interesting story moving forward, and a way to continue the saga without being attached to the Skywalkers anymore. And now you could have that perpetual storytelling that I've mentioned so many times of this constant struggle back and forth and all the different dynamics that could be in play whenever you have a darkness rising and the light to meet it, or the darkness being suppressed and the light being there and the darkness rising to meet it. And again, I would be very, very surprised if Disney and Lucasfilm didn't go that way when they go and make the next saga films. It seems to be the obvious way to continue the storytelling in the largest story of Skywalker storytelling, with, again, not having it at all attached with the former Skywalker line, even though Rey has adopted the name of Skywalker. I hope that made sense. It made sense in my head. If not, I appreciate the fact that you're still here. And because you are, let's go ahead into listener feedback this week.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, thanks to all the friends of the show who reached out this week. Got a couple of emails to share with you. First one comes from SheVP, who says this: the only disappointment I had for the 4th was that I had been waiting since The Rise of Skywalker for Disney to release Leia's lightsaber, and they released it in a set with the reforged saber that sold out. People were saying in 15 minutes. I was so bummed. But today, Disney came through and released it by itself. I've ordered mine, and I can't wait to get it. I love the Bad Batch as well. I don't know if you've seen this, but someone has spliced the Force theme and the Mandalorian theme together, and it's one of the most beautiful mixes I've heard. And they ended up sharing a link, and I was really appreciative of that, SheVP. Thank you. Great show as always, John. Thank you so much for the comment. Friend of the show, Miranda, writes this. I think it's fabulous that we are continuing to have fantastic, strong women be a part of Star Wars. Watched The Force Awakens yesterday for the first time in a long while, and it brings back such fond memories. As always, Miranda, thank you for the comment. And lastly, from Page Turners They Were Not, friend of the show, Brennan Marr, says this. Like so many folks, The Bad Batch is the Star Wars show I didn't know I needed. When I first heard the announcement about this new show, I was disappointed. I was hoping for an animated series about Luke and his Jedi Academy, but the more I thought about this new idea, open story, chronicling the clones after the Clone War, the more I found I was sold on the idea. I was so excited as the show arrived, and boy, I was not disappointed. The show is fantastic. Omega is so stinking cute, and her chemistry with the rest of the Bad Batch, especially Hunter, is fantastic. I love that Kanan appeared in the beginning of the show, and I love that we got to see Order 66 from a different point of view. I'm so excited to see where the show goes next, and I just have to say that Lucasfilm has proven they know what they're doing. Totally agree, Brennan. And again, I think it goes to show that when we detach from the main storytelling that has so many, preconceived ideas and notions of what we think this particular story should be, Star Wars still shines and exceeds, right? And The Bad Batch is just more evidence of that, along with The Mandalorian and the other sort of live-action shows that we've seen and the excitement surrounding them. I love what we got from the sequel trilogy. I've always said that, but my gosh, we all know just how much criticism has gone along with that. And really, the biggest reason is because of headcanon and nostalgia and how Star Wars made people feel when they were younger, and when those expectations aren't met, that's when the criticism rises to the top. Plus a bunch of people that make money off the negativity on YouTube, but we won't have to go there right now. All right, that ends the show for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I really do appreciate it. As always, if you want to support My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast, you can go to mynerdworld.net. Right there on the homepage, there is a link to my EMBARK science fiction series. Go and check it out. You can also go to Amazon and just type in EMBARK, Jon Justice. The first 5 books in the series are all available right now in ebook, paperback, and audiobook, with book 6 on the way very soon. With that, I hope you have a fantastic week. It looks like we're finally coming to an end of the stupid pandemic, and I couldn't be happier. But I always appreciate the fact that you tune in and reach out to the show. So thank you so much for that. I hope wherever you are happy, you are healthy, and you are safe. And I'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.